Welcome to the Landscape Podcast. My name is Joel Barnett and I'm your host. And in today's episode, I'm talking with Andrea Proctor from Andrea Proctor Landscapes. Andrea is a landscape architect based in Melbourne. She's got a few people working for her as well. And she's got a great story about how she started and a sliding doors moment about how she got to where she is now. So she knew she wanted to do something in horticulture straight out of school. So that was lucky. And then when she was studying, she'd like to get into like the design side of things. And then she's found that John Patrick was talking at I think it was a library. So she wanted to go there and ask him to do some work experience for him. So she asked him, and he said he doesn't usually do it, but told her to come in. And then she kept, saying, "Can I come back again and again?" So she was really pushing to get the work with him, and then ended up being there for 5.5 years. And while she was there, she met Andrew Laidlaw, and then worked for him for 10 years. And then started her own business. So it all basically snowballed on from just being persistent in wanting to work for someone and not waiting for opportunity to come, but making them come. So I love that part of her story. And she does a lot of work for Botanic Gardens now. Has been involved in designing about 20 of them. So some beautiful work that she's done. So hopefully you enjoy this chat with Andrea Proctor. Andrea, thank you for joining us on the Landscaping Podcast. My first question for you is, how did you start in the industry?
Well, I was one of those very fortunate people who more or less knew what I wanted to do straight out of high school. So I finished high school at 17, and you are actually starting to pick all your preferences and look at where you're wanting to go at the age in year 10, which was 15 for me. So, I mean, I didn't really know what I wanted to do, but I had a sense that I wanted to do horticulture, and I blocked into doing the Bachelor of Horticulture at Burnley, and that was what my aim was to do. And I've been trying to think back, and it's a bit hard to remember, but I don't think I really had much sense of what a job would look like at the end of that. You know, you're at high school and uni was the next obvious thing, but beyond that. So I did get into the Bachelor of Horticulture at Burnley. I had a few other things on my preference list just to flesh it out, including landscape architecture. But the Bachelor of Horticulture was probably one of the lowest enter scores of any course out there at that time, and was the lowest on my list pretty much. So it was my first preference. So I got into that one. So the rest of them became a bit of a, yeah. So I got into Burnley, and by the third year, I'd really figured out that what I wanted to do was design. So I started to stream all my subjects towards design. We had a lot of electives in that final year. We had what was called the Horticulture Project, which everyone who was studying at Burnley had done for years, and was basically a double points entire year research project at the end. And I chose one that was around horticultural therapy because it had a design component involved with it as well. I chose the design subjects at Burnley. I chose the graphics subjects. I even managed to do a landscape architecture and an architecture subject in that final year. And that architecture subject was really interesting because it was a first year architecture subject. It was a drawing one. And I'd had art lessons since I was in primary school. I reckon I still learnt more in that subject than just about any other subject I did at Burnley or at uni. And I got the worst mark in that subject of anyone I think I'd done. So actually, I think sometimes the subjects I got the best marks in weren't the subjects I was learning.
Yeah.
The subjects that I did badly in were actually the ones where I learnt a lot. And the other part of Burnley that was a big thing was there was an industry experience component where you had to go and work in industry, and you had to get about 12 weeks. And by the time I started my third year, I'd clocked up all the time I needed to have to pass the course. I'd worked in a nursery over summer, and I'd also worked on Burnley used to do show gardens for the Flower and Garden Show, and I'd worked on those 2 years in a row. I'd been pretty heavily involved. Students didn't do any design, but we got to help with all the bumping, with manning the stalls. I had an absolute blast. Ian Winston and Michael Green were running those, and I loved it. But I was in this nice position by third year that I didn't have to clock up formal hours, but I was wanting to get some experience in a design firm. And about halfway through that year, my local library was having a talk by a well-known local landscape architect. And I knew John's firm was one of the few that actually hired Burnley graduates. He taught at Burnley, he supported Burnley. And I was 19 and I was petrified, but I went to the talk and I was probably the youngest person in the room. I think there was another couple of people my age. I know one of my friends' mums was there. And I spent the entire talk going, I have to ask for work experience. I have to ask for work experience. Like, just really try to talk myself, you have to do this. And I went up at the end and I asked, and John said, look, we don't take work experience because it's too hard in the office to try and sort of direct those people, which I completely understand running my own business now. But he said, if you're happy to come and just job shadow. And I said, yes. So I came in and I spent a week doing that. And we were chatting before we started about the changes in technology. And one of the jobs they got me to do in that first week was, it was a 2-story office and there were people upstairs and downstairs, and they had 2 massive folders of construction details that people had done over the years, where if you'd done a project, you'd done, you could open it up and there's all these construction details of paving and there's all these designs for ponds. And they were the sort of thing that if you were doing a design, it's the sort of thing we have on our computers these days. You pull up the old one and you go, okay, I can edit this into what I want. And my job was to photocopy those folders one by one to create a duplicate copy for upstairs so people weren't having to run up and down the stairs. But it was brilliant because I'm just being exposed to all these details. And it was literally, you had to do it one by one on the photocopier, punch them, sort them. And in between, I was being brought out to look at projects. I think, not sure if it was that week, John took me to Government House because he had a meeting there. I just got to tag along and I loved it. And I said, look, can I come back in the September break? And John said yes. And between the July and September, I had some embarrassingly rudimentary CAD skills. I'd done a little bit of graphics. I knew how to colour a plan professionally. And I remember that September break from teaching, a couple of the subjects had just piled us with homework like you wouldn't believe. So I was just trying to get all this work done so I could go back and do another week of work experience. And I did get through it and I got back to do that second week. But by that stage, I actually had some skills that were useful. And the big one for them was John did a lot of VCAT, planning tribunal, and you'd have to go in with a big coloured landscape plan. And, Photoshop existed, Illustrator existed, but they were so painfully, dreadfully, horribly slow and clunky. The most efficient and the most effective way was to get a CAD drawing and hand colour it. Big box of Derwent pencils, hardly any greens left because it was a landscape architecture office, so it was full of reds and blues and no greens. And I coloured the drawing. And basically, off the back of that, they're like, okay, I'm useful. I said, can I come back in December? Yes. And in December, it was like, okay, we can give you summer work, no guarantee. But I was still there 5.5 years later,
Yeah.
by which stage I was one of the longest serving people in the design office. I was supervising projects. I was helping develop some of the, standards around the office. It was an amazing experience.
What was the business?
It was John Patrick Landscape Architects. So I think John's retired now, but the business is still around. Oh. But they did landscape design, but they also did horticulture. So one of the things that came up quite quickly was that their consulting arborist was looking like moving on. So John got me to go back to Burnley. I did one of the arboriculture subjects, which I hadn't done before, and I did it as a CAP subject, a community access program, where you can just go and do a single subject. I'm not sure if a lot of people know you can do that. You don't have to get into an entire course. So I went and did that, and I started doing the tree reports. I also, then when I was there for a few years, I'd done some heritage, because I also went and studied landscape architecture while working for John as well. And I'd done some history and heritage, and John did a lot of heritage reports working with the Botanic Gardens and the historic gardens. And when the senior heritage planner left, I ended up picking up her unfinished projects. So I was doing a lot of heritage work. I was doing a lot of tree assessment work. Lots of development reports around trees, lots of reports explaining to another person in great detail why their Monterey pines weren't viable, why their Monterey cypress were falling apart, to architects as to why they couldn't put a gun barrel driveway next to the boundary, next to the neighbour's tree. There was a lot of that. And I did get to do a bit of design work for John. I got to do my first couple of residentials. But the other thing that happened when I was there about 2 years was I remember going out to reception one day from the back office, and there was someone at reception to meet John. And I think I recognised him because Andrew was quite well known in the industry at that stage. He given a lecture to me at Burnley, but I got introduced to Andrew Laidlaw. And Andrew came and worked for John for a while. And Andrew had just finished the children's garden in at the Botanic Gardens at Melbourne. He'd been there as their landscape architect. He'd done them first master plan. He'd done the children's garden. I think he'd done a couple of other projects there, but his role had moved from full-time to part-time with the gardens, and he was doing a bit of work on the side in his own business the other time, and he actually came and spent that time working for John for a bit over a year. And because he was part-time in the office, he got assigned someone from the office to basically be handling the day-to-day on each of the projects he was working on. And I was one of those people. We both lived in the Dandenongs at the time. I think I moved into Melbourne partway through that period, but we both lived in the Dandenongs. So we did, I was trying to remember the projects we did. There was quite a few that were just sort of the bread and butter work of an office, but there was one particular residential in the Dandenongs. And we also did the master plan for Kawarra Native Garden, which was my first exposure to botanic gardens, which have become a huge part of my working life. And it was also the first time I'd worked on a master plan of that scale, community consultation, stakeholder consultation, a working group, that sort of strategic approach, editing reports, copywriting reports, doing the graphics, all of that, which has just become such a big part of my work. It was the first time I'd done any of that. And it was also how I learnt Andrew's got a fairly distinctive style in how he draws, and I draw similarly because I love his graphic style, but I actually learnt to do it that way because I remember the master plan drawing was like a massive A0 sheet, and it must have been between the first draft and the last draft, but basically it had to be redrawn. So I'm busy tracing Andrew's graphics and redrawing it. And by the time I got to the end of that A0, my hand was in. And I say that to my students with the graphics. A lot of it is building muscle memory in your hands. Just trace, 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 and you'll get your hand in. But I think one of the things with Andrew's work was when I was at Burnley, it was early 2000s. We had the Millennium Drought. A lot of council maintenance work had been outsourced, and Burnley was full of low maintenance, talking about maintenance contracts, how to write maintenance contracts. Water was a really big thing, zero-scape gardens, but zero-scape gardens that they were talking about then were not what we consider as zero-scaping as far as no water use. It actually was pretty much no plants. And all the design people were getting excited about was this really postmodernist. It was a lot of it, I think now I've got a bit of perspective, was actually trying to be quite fun and different, things like Martha Schwartz's Bagel Garden and things, but they were all talked about very, very seriously in how they were presented to us as students. And there were no plants in them. And I liked plants. And I was convinced at that stage that I didn't like contemporary design. And then I got introduced to Andrew's work. And I came across a quote this week. Christopher Dunn's an Irish landscape designer who's been moved I don't know if you've seen his Instagram, but he's...
Yeah, I've messaged him to come on, actually. But I have to follow up with him. So
Yes. Yeah. He's been really great when I've reached out to him, and I'm using his videos for my students because he's really talking about the mechanics of running a design practice. But he had a quote the other day, and I can't remember who the quote was by, but it was, you can present a design to a client and you can have one of three responses. Yes, no, wow. And you want, wow is what you want. And wow is what I thought when I looked at Andrew's work. And it was, I mean, I don't think this will surprise anyone who knows his work, but it was contemporary and it was clever, as in intelligent, and it was thoughtful and it was full of plants. And it was like, I'd found the sort of design that I loved. That was the style I loved. And I think what he does is actually, I mean, his work is incredible. And I mean, he really does do work like no one else, I think, in Melbourne does. But I think the rest of the industry sort of caught up a little bit more to his approach. And, you know, good planting design and exciting contemporary planting is actually where the cutting edge of horticulture is these days. But back then it wasn't so much, and there wasn't Instagram and there wasn't the internet, and until things actually got published in books, you didn't even know it was out there. So it wasn't like you had exposure. I think it's easier for my students these days because you can get exposed to so many different styles to help find what it is that you love, where my generation didn't have that so much. And I can even remember going to a talk sometime in the mid 2000s where James Hitchmore was out from the UK and he was presenting those incredible flower meadows they did for the 2012 Olympics. And it was the first time I'd heard of it. And it was like 3 or 4 years old. But even in the mid 2010s, you're still having to go to talks to actually find out what people were doing. So, and maybe, look, I was a bit behind with catching up with some of that social media and things, but it really is a fairly new phenomenon that, someone does something awesome in Chicago and you know about it 2 days later.
Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, Andrew's work was it's like, this is the sort of work I love. Yeah. So I got to work with him for a couple of years at John's. Work-life balance wasn't working for him and he stepped back and I kept going. And then it reached the point that I'd been 5 years there. It was my first job out of uni. I was pretty much doing tree reports and heritage reports, and I'd learnt so much in that office. I really had. But I wanted to get back into design. I also wanted to move back out of Melbourne, back to the Dandenongs, where my friends and family were. And it was the middle of the global financial crisis. And what came out of the GFC, but it was nicknamed the School Halls Project, the BER, Building the Education Revolution, but there was a lot of money for school projects. And Andrew, off the back of the Children's Garden, was being asked to work on these projects. He had his own business. It was himself and his wife, Sarah. He was doing some residentials, but he didn't have the capacity to start doing this bigger work without some help. And I knew I was ready to move on. And I caught up with Andrew for a cup of coffee. And he said, look, would you be interested in helping with some CAD work here? And that conversation ended up leading to a job 3 days a week. And 10 years later, I was still working for him. And we got to do some absolutely amazing projects. And I think one of the things with Andrew too is he's a really good teacher. He's taught at Burnley for 40 years now, but I can remember even when I was working at John, Andrew sitting down at the drawing board with me and teaching me how to do levels. How do you do grading? How do you do drainage? And, he'd give me a plan to draw up and then he'd talk, and he'd just explain, and this is why you do this way. And I just kept picking up those bits and pieces for all those years through the office. And I think one of the nice things about when I came in working for Andrew was him and Sarah had been doing it for a long time, but it had all been hand drawing. They'd all been doing smaller projects. And I'd done a little bit of work at John's in sort of, getting templates together for reports and some of those sort of procedural things for an office. But I was really there at the ground up when the business was starting to grow. So like my first day on the job was designing the computer title blocks for the business, getting the CAD standards together, getting those initial blocks that you need, getting the line weights sorted, all of that. And then, working through company profiles, working through templates for reports. All of that had to happen at that start of the business. And I was involved in all of that. And we had this we worked incredibly closely and collaboratively on projects, but there was also a fairly strong division of tasks. So Andrew would do all the initial design work. He'd do most of the client meetings, and then it would come to me for design development and documentation. So all of the, basically Andrew's sketches would come and I'd be the one who would pull that together. I would get the levels working. I would get the layouts working. I'd make sure the paths were the right widths and the steps were the right number of steps. But then I'd also do all the detailing for the construction as well in consultation with him. He'd then do the planting design and usually most of the construction supervision. But most of the correspondence of the project was falling to me and most of that sort of admin and project management. So I got this incredibly good grounding in all aspects of the projects. And because it was just, Sarah did a bit of work, but it was mostly the pair of us working on these projects, I got exposed to just so much. Andrew had such good processes in place. And those sort of developed as we worked together and we learned on projects as well. And then the other thing that happened was about 6 months after I started, Andrew's wife, Sarah, was actually diagnosed with cancer, which turned out to be terminal. And he had spoken about this on Gardening Australia. And I wasn't sure about mentioning it here, but it's relevant in that as Sarah, over time, as she got sicker, I had to take over some of the business side of running the business as well. So things like invoicing and fee proposals and, you know, insurances and all that sort of thing. So that by the end of it, the only thing I really wasn't involved in was I didn't do initial design and I didn't particularly do planting design, but from a business side, the only thing I wasn't doing was the payroll and the taxes, which these days I've got an accountant and a bookkeeper to take care of for me. But every other side of running the business, I actually ended up being involved in. Yeah, so I started working for Andrew. We had some of those school hall projects, and then we got sort of three big projects that really kicked off Laidlaw and Laidlaw Design. One was the master plan for the Kyneton Botanic Gardens, and I can still remember winning that. I think I actually had to almost write the template for how we did submissions in order to put in that submission. And I've got a vague recollection what we quoted on it, and I reckon it was about a quarter of what it would cost these days. But they're still using that master plan, you know. And we also got a couple of master plans and some high-profile play spaces for City of Melbourne. And off them, we went on to do Kyneton Community Park and the Benalla Rocket Park. We did master plans for Williamstown Botanic Gardens, Hamilton, and Wombat Hill Botanic Gardens. Incredible little play space, which is still one of my favourite projects I've ever done down in Meetung at Patterson Park. And even just the other day, I was pulling up some of the old details from one of the projects we worked on. And that whole thing about yes, no, and wow, I even looked through some of the old things that we documented or Andrew designed, and they're elements that never got built, which is why I've forgotten about them. They're things that just fell by the wayside with the projects. And I still look at them and go, wow, that's that. Wow, I totally forgotten that.
So would you incorporate that into something going forward now that's refreshed in your memory again?
Possibly. I must admit, I didn't look into it in huge amount of detail. I was hunting for something else, but quite possibly. And actually, one of the reasons I was going through it was that there was a funky little tap detail we did on one of the projects. And it had a fair bit of fun doing that detail because we had no budget and we had to work out how to do water play with no budget. And my brother's a plumber. And I actually worked it out with him. He got me he said, okay, you need this tap fitting and this, and you do this and you do this. And I was actually looking for all the specs on that little tap fitting. So sometimes it's those little things that are actually quite fun.
Mm. Yeah, it's funny. I did a design and I loved the design, but didn't think it'd get built. And I also designed my house very similar because I just wanted to do it. And then we ended up getting that job as well, and I did mine.
Yep.
So I've got two jobs which are almost identical.
Yes.
But that's if you want to do something, you just got to keep putting it in designs until someone says yes to it.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I'm trying to think. There's been a couple of things lately like that have come up. There's this wonderful little detail that actually Andrew ended up doing at the Botanic Gardens in Melbourne, where there's these big steppers across the water. I wanted to do that in projects for years, and in the end, Andrew got it up.
Yeah.
And actually, I've got a project under construction at the moment where we have got that same detail. Yeah.
So what do you think it was going back to when you were at school, knowing what you wanted to do? Like, how did you know it? Like, because a lot of people don't know anything about horticulture, that it exists in school.
Yeah. Well, look, I think part of it was my parents are farmers. My parents are berry farmers. So I grew up with plants. I grew up working outdoors. Wonderful garden. My dad's a really good gardener. My grandmother was an amazing gardener. And when I was about 12, we moved up to the house and the garden she created. So I think I had that exposure there. I did work experience in year 10 at a production nursery and loved it. But equally, I think one of the things that pushed me towards design was I realised by the time I was that stage through uni, I didn't want a job working outdoors all the time. It wasn't the summer heat, it was the winter cold that got me.
I hear you.
Yeah. Yeah. I'd worked outside. I could handle the hot days. They weren't fun, but I could handle them. But the freezing fingers in winter was just...
Especially if you're from the Dandenongs as well, so that's next level.
Yeah. Yeah. And I must admit, I hadn't even done, I was mostly working in summer anyway. So it wasn't even like I'd done my fair slog of the winter work, but I knew that wasn't what I wanted to be doing.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think I've come from a family of people who love gardens.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
and so you were with Andrew for 10 years, was it? Did you
I
say?
was with Andrew for 10 years. And from 2016, I had the opportunity to then start working with him at the Botanic Gardens in Melbourne. So they've operated under a master plan for the last 20 years. So it's basically this big picture planning document that's got all the detail, not the details, but the sort of the general approach on projects and direction for the next 20 years. And in 2016, though, it was due for renewal. The first one Andrew had done back in 1997. And they realised that they could have gone to external consultants, but there weren't a lot of external consultants that had the knowledge and the approach. They had this incredible team of people who knew what they were doing in-house. They just didn't have the capacity to do it themselves. So I got to come in and help with that capacity. So I've known Andrew for nearly 20 years now. And during that period of sort of 2017, 18, 19, I've never known him in that entire 20 years to have so much going on at the Botanic Gardens as he had in that period. He had the master plan, he had arid garden, he had sensory garden, he had, what else was going on in that period? He had the last of the Fern Gully. He usually sort of got one project at a time at Melbourne by my observation, but there was so much going on then. So I got to help with all of those projects as well. I got to work a day or two a week from the Botanic Gardens in Melbourne, and it was wonderful. It was so wonderful. So I was in the design office there and doing the master plan and all the consultation. You get a chance to work with everyone from the apprentices to the board. So you sort of get, and across all the different divisions. So you sort of get this different perspective as well. So that was fabulous. So the master plan took longer than expected because it was complicated, but yeah, I'm really happy with how that document's turned out. And I was basically there till I was COVIDed out of the place.
Oh,
So
wow.
yeah, I
So
remember
still just
yeah.
one day a week, was it? Or
It was, I think I was probably averaging a couple of days a week, but it was probably a day or two a week actually in at the Botanic Gardens. So because some of that was work from home as well, or but yes, I remember it was late March 2020. I think it was a Monday. I didn't usually work on a Monday. And basically the news was reaching the point, it's like, yeah, I think I got to start working from home. And I went in on a Monday to get all my gear and all my files and everything. And that was basically the day everything, it's like the 27th of March or something. That was the day everything blew up with COVID because I'd gone in to say, look, I think I need to be working from home. And Andrew came in to say, look, I've spoken to my boss. You need to be working from home. And I basically, other than the odd meeting, I never went back after that because the project's basically finished over those next 2 years. The other thing that was happening at that time was the Botanic Gardens had a restructure and Andrew's position moved from being part-time back to full-time again. So he had to make that decision and he chose to go back to the gardens, which meant Laidlaw and Laidlaw wound up. And I'd never seen myself running my own business. It was never something I was interested in. I sort of had the attitude that working with John to start with and then working with Andrew, I was getting much more interesting projects working with other people than I would on my own. But what I realised with Laidlaw and Laidlaw finishing up was I loved the type of work I did with Andrew, but I really loved the processes and approaches we'd built. We were very collaborative in the sort of work we did, collaborative with the clients, particularly the public work, collaborative with, all the staff and the friends groups and everyone involved. And I didn't want to relearn someone else's work methods. So the obvious thing was to start my own business. And Andrew was so supportive in giving me a leg up in those early days. So the first day of actually starting my own business, and it did overlap with the Botanic Gardens work a bit, the first day of starting my own business was actually, it's like the 30th of December 2019, which was the day before the Chinese government mentioned to the World Health Organization that there was this weird pneumonia in Wuhan. So I literally started the business the day before COVID hit. Um,
perfect.
yeah, it worked out fine, but Andrew, he said to me, he said, look, everything we've done together, all that shared IP, you're welcome to it. He said, any of the projects we've worked on together, I didn't ask. He said, you are welcome to share them, to use them for promotion. As he was getting requests for projects, he was saying, look, I'm not doing this. Andrea can do them. And really soon I was then getting work off the back of the work I'd done on my own. And I ended up employing someone fairly quickly. And there's now, I've got part-timers, but there's five of us now.
Oh,
Actually, I can't keep track because I've got a few part-timers, but it's myself and Sandro's full-time, and then a few part-time people as well. And it's going great. And because I'd been involved with Laidlaw and Laidlaw from the start in building up that business, I knew exactly what to do when it was starting with my own. So it's just a matter of doing those things for my own business. And I've already had that experience once over with Andrew, twice over if I'd done some of that work for John. The only thing I wasn't so familiar with was the business management side of it. But my parents are farmers, they've been small business owners for forever. So I had, they could basically help me with all that other stuff, give me advice on, the tax and the registrations and all that sort of thing that goes with it, and the employees and how all of that works. But yeah, the rest of it I'd already done once before. So it's just a matter of rolling it out again.
yeah, it's a similar way to how I started my business because I'd never had any intention of doing it. I'd actively said that I'll never work for myself. And
Yeah.
then it just got to the point where I felt like I was doing a lot of the running of the business. I wasn't,
Yes.
but I thought I was at the time.
Yes.
But so yeah, then I just thought, it can't be too hard. So I guess I'll give it a crack. And yeah, and
Yep.
I took over from my boss, so it wasn't like I was starting something new, completely new. So
Yes.
yeah, it's kind of similar to the way you've done it.
It's really similar because I did, to a certain degree, I didn't take over Andrew's projects, but he handed the baton on.
Yeah,
So it was a similar sort of thing. I had this leg up. I wasn't having to sort of convince people. One of the hard things was actually coming up with the name of the business. It ended up being very boring, but it's really hard because you're not allowed anything that anyone else has got, and most of the regular names have been long taken.
yeah.
So I'm not convinced on my business name, but it was a way of people finding me at least.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And the business name, it means something to get you work at the start, but then it means nothing after that. It's just then it's
Yes.
patient. So they're not a lot of people put a lot of thought into it at the start, but they don't really mean as much as what the effort you put into it.
Yeah. And in the
So
end, you just need something in order to be able to be registered, in order to be able to start.
exactly.
Yeah.
You can't just have a blank in the business name section.
No, you can't.
So did you get were you doing any residential at the time or was they a lot of those larger projects like public space?
We do a little bit of residential. So we've actually got a residential that's under construction at the moment, which was actually my first project. So it's been going for 5 years, that
Right.
project. It's had all sorts of, basically we got involved way back when it was still in town planning. And then there were delays with construction because they were living in the house. So over COVID, of course, there were limits on, the build stretched out because you weren't allowed to have builders on when you were living in the house, et cetera, et cetera. But the landscaping's just going in at the moment and we're just getting into planting design. So we do a little bit of residential. I like doing the hills projects. Again, I think as you go on, you really do learn what your strengths are as a designer, but also what comes naturally to you. And living most of my life in the Dandenongs, the hills gardens are just, it's easy. And I think you see that with someone like Fiona Brockhoff with the ocean and with the coastal gardens. There's just this effortlessness to it because she lives and breathes and knows that landscape. And I figured that out. Actually, one of the last projects I did with Andrew was a project for Hillsville Sanctuary. And again, it was just sort of, I went, oh, wait, I didn't even need to think too hard about what looked right for that project. I just knew. There was no sort of getting to grips with the place. So we do a bit of hills work with the residentials, absolutely willing to go further afield. It's just we've really fallen into doing a lot of botanic gardens work. And that's partially because there's been a lot of botanic gardens work out there at the moment. Victoria's got that incredible history of botanic gardens, so there's lots of them. And I'm somewhere up around 20 botanic gardens I've worked for now.
Yeah.
So,
I saw you were just
yeah.
overseas recently doing something with the
Yes.
Botanic Gardens of Australia and New Zealand, was it? Or was it a different?
Yes, so they just recently had the Global Botanic Gardens Congress in Singapore. So the last one was in Melbourne a couple of years ago. So I got to go to that one. The local Botanic Gardens network was sort of promoting people putting in abstracts to give talks, which I hadn't even thought of doing. And then when they're actually looking for people to speak, I was like, oh, maybe. So I phoned up John Arnott, who was manager horticulture at Cranbourne and was on the vegans committee. I said, look, John, what do you think? He's like, yeah, put one in. So, and this is one of the things John's been great at in his career, is pulling people into things. So I put in an abstract for Melbourne. And then he was also wanting to do a workshop around collections management. So the basic difference between a botanic garden and a public garden is botanic gardens are about plant collections. They're about plants that are being grown so you can learn about them and you can teach people about them. He was wanting to do a collection around workshop around that. So he put my name in as well because I've worked with a lot of these smaller regional gardens and I understood some of the challenges that they had as opposed to the biggest gardens that, that have plenty of staff and good resources. And then that one ended up being sleeved in with a team from Missouri Botanic Gardens. So all of a sudden I'm getting to do this work with these incredible international plants people. So it was just one of those things that just sort of kept unfolding from there. So when the next one came up in Singapore's relatively easy to get to from Australia. So there was a big Australian contingent. I'm not sure there'll be the same level of Australian contingent to Chicago in a few years' time. But that Botanic Gardens Congress is a fantastic conference to go to. And it's not about design, it's about botanic gardens. They have all these streams, so you can really pick what you're interested in, from, management to, public and visitor programs, to everything through to seed collecting and that sort of thing, which that is not my area. But I find I learn so much in those because you just have people from all over the world. A lot of the presentations are 15 minutes, so they're having to distill down everything that they are doing to something really short and sharp. And I got to present on master planning botanic gardens in Singapore, which was fantastic, and also some work my team's been doing for BGANS, which is Botanic Gardens Australia and New Zealand.
Have you been to Singapore before?
I had been to Singapore before. I've actually been to Singapore more than anywhere else overseas,
Yeah, yeah.
but
I've been there once, but I absolutely loved it.
yeah, I actually got to go to Singapore. It was my first overseas trip just before I started at the Botanic Gardens at Melbourne. And just from a horticultural perspective, blew my mind. It's like you're looking at plants and you go, I didn't even know a flower could look like that. Yeah.
And just all the plants within the buildings as well, with all the
Yes.
green roofs. They got insane gardens up there.
Yeah. And Singapore Botanic Gardens is still one of my favourite gardens in the world. It's just beautiful. And it was lovely being able to be over there with a whole lot of other plant people that you could just wander around, go, oh, look at this, look at this, look at this, with, yeah,
You'd trouble
really,
getting somewhere on time because you'd be stopping and looking at stuff, I imagine.
yeah, yeah. And because I'd been there before, I could actually relax on this trip. I wasn't trying to get around and see everything because I had been before. So I sort of turned into the person who knew the good restaurants and where to eat and the
Yeah,
hawker centres and that sort
perfect.
of thing. Yeah. But no, it was a lot of fun. And I think sometimes those things are really good for just being able to step back and remember why you love doing what you do.
Yeah. So when you first got your first project, were you comfortable with pricing it properly because you'd been doing, well, you'd at least seen that before?
Yeah.
Or
Yes and no. Yes, I was, because I had been doing all of that work for Andrew. What I found though was when I was doing it on behalf of someone else, I was much more comfortable going, no, this is fair and reasonable, because you feel like you're sort of looking after that other person. When you're doing it on your own, it's much harder to, actually have the confidence that your fees are reasonable. And that's where, again, having someone like Andrew, and even to this day, if I've got something I'm not sure on, I think one of the things I love about this industry is how, and I mean, this podcast's a really good example of it, is how generous everyone is with their time and their knowledge. And you have those people that you can call on with anything that you're just not 100% sure on. What do you think? Does this sound reasonable? And Andrew is still that person to this day I can have those conversations with. And there's other people as well, not necessarily on pricing, but other things. Ross Ubergang's great. I know you had him on a few weeks ago, but you have those people that you can get on the phone to and go, hey. And I have former students who do the same thing with me. But I do find it is much easier to get that perspective when you're giving someone else advice than when you're trying to actually hold that line yourself. And that's where the public projects to a certain degree are easier because they're tendered. You put in the price that you are happy to do it for. If it's too expensive, you just don't get the project.
Yep. Yeah, there's no back and forth or trying to twist your arm.
No, or worrying that you've charged too much for something.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I know now we're not always the cheapest, but we're not the most expensive. And we work quite hard to put in a price and stick to it.
As long as you're happy that you deliver the value that you've offered, then it doesn't matter what other people are charging.
No.
So I did a project, like a design, which is like a larger one, and I charged $16,000 for it, and that was like just insane. Like I'd never been anywhere near that price for a design, and I thought it was insane. But I'd probably broke even on it, if not lost a little bit, because I knew there was a lot of work involved, but I didn't know as much as what there was actually involved.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's staggering how much things can cost.
It is, and particularly so, I mean, with residentials, we try to quote for through to the end of design and then documentation separately. Not always, because that's where if you quote all the way through to the end of documentation, we will never, if we've got a fixed fee for documentation, we're never going to crib on the design because we know it's going to take us forever to document it. So sometimes you just end up wearing the fact that you've taken longer because it's a more complex project to document. But that is where, you quite often don't know the level of detail that's required until you've got through that initial design process.
Yeah. And the last guest I spoke with was Andy Murray. I don't know what sequence this will come out in, but he said with his designs, he keeps track of how long he spends on each design.
Yes.
So then when he does another similar one, he knows how long it's going to take. So do you do something similar to that?
I do. I do. And that's something that I've sort of introduced to my business that I don't think we did at Andrews, but I keep track of my time and everyone's time. At the end of a project, I'll have a look through and work out where we were actually sitting. And it's really, really valuable. And when I've got another project that comes up, I mean, I might sort of I like to sort of come up with a rough cut of how long I think and what the cost might be. But then I might pull up one of the other projects we've done that I think's a similar scale and go, oh, okay, this is how long we spent on documentation. This is how much we spent on design. It's really, really valuable tracking that. It takes ages, but it's really valuable doing it. And look, you need to record that sort of thing for anything that you do have at an hourly rate as well.
Yeah.
And
you mentioned some of your students before. So you're teaching at Burnley. Are you still doing that now? When did that start?
It started vague. You know those things that you start doing and you never really take any notice of when you started because you didn't know it was going to be a big deal? It was sometime around 2011, 2012, somewhere around that. But I started by taking the computer classes. So there were 2 computer classes. Ross does them now. Ross is much better with the computer classes, I think, than I am. He's extraordinary with them. But I started doing that. And then, so it was the Graduate Certificate of Garden Design, and it was part of the University of Melbourne commercial, which was still run through Burnley. But when it moved back into the main university and then also became an elective for master's students, at that stage I got brought in to help more because it was a bit like the Botanic Gardens at Melbourne. Andrew just didn't have the capacity to do all of that himself, so he was teaching. And then in 2019 I got the offer of taking over the coordination of the last 2 years of the design subjects for the associate degree, which doesn't exist anymore. So by that stage, I was doing things like, budgets and timetables and crit work and marking and things. But I actually got a chance to coordinate those subjects. And then in 2020, Andrew decided that he didn't want to do the coordination, which is all the admin and basically all that budgets and timetables and marking and all of that. And I ended up taking over from him at the start of 2020 on the master's subjects. He still teaches into it. But he has joked that the best career move he ever made was handing that over just before COVID hit. because we then had 2 years of online learning
Yep.
and the roller coaster that went with that. So yes, so I coordinate 2 subjects at Burnley at the moment, and I've been doing that probably similar sort of work since about 2017, but I've been coordinating for the last 5 years now, and it's been an amazing experience. And I think we learn as much as the students.
Yeah. So what is it, the courses that are still available at Burnley?
So that's the graduate certificate in garden design, but it's part of the Masters of Urban Horticulture. I must admit, this is not my area of expertise, but I know there's a grad certificate in garden design. There's a graduate certificate in arboriculture, which is more sort of heading towards the consultancy end of ARB. I think there's a green infrastructure one focusing on green roofs and walls, but the big one is the Masters of Urban Horticulture. You can also do a graduate diploma in urban horticulture, which is the Masters is 2 years full-time and the grad dips half of that, so it's 1 year full-time. And then they also teach some of the undergraduate courses from classes from Parkville at Burnley as well.
And what was the course that stopped happening there that everyone
It was,
seemed to
it
do?
was the associate degree.
Right.
I'm not 100% sure when that started because I was at Burnley as a student from 2001 to 2004. And then because Andrew and I, the classes we teach are actually all of an evening and on a weekend, because there's sort of this run on from back when it used to be night school. And we get heaps of career changes. So it suits people really well to have evening classes. But it really means sometimes, it's not that way now, but for a long time, it was really ships in the night with what was happening on the rest of the campus,
Oh
because
yeah.
you'd literally be getting there at 5 in the evening to maybe say hello to whoever's locking up their office at the end of the day.
Yeah.
We were there, but didn't really have much of a sense about everything else that was going on around us.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
every time I speak to someone who went to Burnley, I always ask them who they studied with because it always seems to be a bunch of superstars. Was there anyone who was talented when you went there that turned out to work with themselves?
It's funny because I lost track of virtually everyone I was at uni with. I've got a suspicion that part of it was, again, the technology thing. Dropped my phone, pre-Facebook, pre-anything like that. Boom, there goes your contacts, dead. But I recently ran into someone called Jess Vanderworth, who I was friends with at Burnley, and she's now a manager with City of Glen Ira, but she's been with Botanic Gardens the whole way. But Jess actually said there's only 2 or 3 of us from my cohort that are actually still in the industry.
All
So
right.
some of the people I studied with landscape architecture with at Melbourne Uni are out doing their own thing. So Phoebe Coogan at Plant A, for example, is doing lovely work. But Burnley, with the exception of me and Jess, I don't really run across people I was at Burnley with anymore, which was interesting. I was the first year of the Bachelor of Horticulture, and that course didn't last a huge amount of time. One of my staff, Emma Hurd, who's fantastic, she does 3CR gardening show with Chloe. I think she was at the back end of the Bachelor of Horticulture at Burnley. But yes, it was a bit of that course came in. So I don't know whether it attracted a different group of people to what had been there earlier. But yes, interestingly, that wasn't my cohort.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember when I studied Cert 4 in horticulture before I started landscaping, and yeah, I don't think anyone from that would be. Actually, there's one landscape architect actually, but
Yeah.
but yeah, that's yes, because some people get into it for different reasons as well, not
Yeah.
not necessarily because they want that as a career.
Yeah. I know there was a couple of us that Jess said was still in it,
Yeah,
but I was a relatively small cohort as well. Yeah.
and I saw one of your recent projects that just opened up was clouds. Was it something to do?
The
It's in the
cloud
Dandenong
forest.
cloud
Yep.
forest.
Yeah. So that's a project up Dandenong Ranges Botanic Gardens. It used to be called the National Rhododendron Gardens. So when the Linda Golf Course shut, they got about, I'm not quite sure, 6 hectares taken over there. Philip Johnson's Chelsea Gardens in there. And then just down the hill is this Cloud Forest Garden. So this is a Botanic Gardens collection-based landscape. Probably the really interesting thing about it is Australia's got native rhododendrons, which I actually didn't know till I started working on this project. But there's 2, rhododendron viviosum and rhododendron lockii. They're both veraeas, red flowers. If you know veraeas, the sort of spindly lower shrub ones. But they come from up in the Atherton tablelands in Queensland. And there'd been this big multi-agency project. It was Royal Botanic Gardens Victoria, Australian National Botanic Gardens, James Cook University and the Tropical Herbarium, Rhododendron Society, to go up and do collecting trips for these plants and other plants up there, which are threatened species. And then they've developed what's called a meta collection, where you have all these plants in different gardens across Australia. And they're all accessioned and provenanced, which means that they actually know, they have all the records of what was the mother plant that plant was collected from, which one of the mountain tops, where was it collected, which other plants in which other gardens are the same genetic material. And all of them have got these big, if you actually go and have a look carefully, because you don't want to break the plants, these big accession labels that have got that numbering system on them. So they know where all these plants came from. And even in the rhododendrons, there's about 7 or 8 different mountain tops, and all of them are slightly different. You know, one's a bit taller, one's a bit shaggier, one's got bigger flowers. It's a really different approach to planting design. It's totally different to any way you'd normally go about it. So instead of actually going, okay, what's the look and feel I want here, you get presented with a heap of plants and design a garden around these plants.
Right.
And a lot of them, you do design work, you'd understand a lot of these are shrubs of about, 4 to 5 meters. Not the easiest things to design a garden around. The rhododendrons are shorter. And the other one is a lot of these plants, we've got no idea how they're going to grow in Alinda from a form point of view.
That's what I was going to ask. It's a bit different in the Atherton tablelands, I assume.
Yeah, because when you see plants in the wild and you know them in cultivation, they look completely different.
Mm.
Interestingly, Alinda's actually got a very similar climate to the Atherton tablelands. If anything,
Ah.
it's slightly warmer in Alinda, but Alinda was chosen because it's a pretty good climate match. But we've got all these plants, and I must admit, I've seen Andrew do this at the Botanic Gardens at Melbourne as well. You do the initial cut of the planting design, and you're busy Googling these plants or looking at your databases, okay? Because I had good information from people like Warren Warboys at Cranbourne of what these plants were like. But, some of these I've never heard of the genus. So you're going, okay, what's that plant again, and how big is that? And then when it comes to the next cut of plant, and that's through the propagation lists, and then you send out the propagation lists and they come back and go, oh, and this plant that you really wanted a lot of, well, we haven't been able to propagate it. Or this plant, well, it propagated, but they all died up at Alinda in the greenhouse. And then you come to do the planting design and you're Googling the plants again and you're looking the plants up again. And then you're out on site and you've got this plant and you're looking at it and going, which one was this again? And, we've got our phones out and, it'll say, oh, a lot of the information is only botanical. So it's got all this information on the petiole lengths and the stamens and the number of flowers, but nothing on the cultivation of it. And you're looking at it and it says medium tree from 5 to 25 metres. This does not help. So,
Bit of a range.
But look, you're working with really amazing horticulturists up there who have a good sense. And we've got a sense of what these plants are going to do. And there were people that were helping with plant set out that were on the actual collecting trips. So we're pretty confident, but there will be some plants that will just surprise us because you just don't know what a plant will be like in different soil and in a different location. And that's one of the really exciting things in that project. And being just 15 minutes up the road from me, I'm really looking forward to actually being able to go regularly and see how this project grows, where most of my work's been regional. I've got a project that I did a lot of work on that I've never visited because I was never able to get back because it's a 5-hour drive away. So,
Is that the Meetung one?
No, that's actually Warrnambool. So I have been back to Meetung.
That's Meetung's not too close.
No, it's not. But I've done more work down that way where I haven't been able to get back to Warrnambool. That one all went in over COVID, so we weren't allowed to do any site visits. And then I just haven't managed to get back to Warrnambool. But I'm really looking forward to being able to see how this one goes.
Yeah, it's such a fascinating. It's a really great. I'm looking forward to people listening to this episode because it's such a fascinating way of doing landscape design. Because, people don't think of that side of it, and that was something I was going to ask: is how difficult it is doing a design for botanic gardens, because I know they're a collection of plants, so it's not about just doing the same one and make it look good. So I didn't know you actually go into the detail of specifying the plants as well.
Yes, you do. You do. And look, some of the Botanic Gardens ones are less collection based, but our office always tries to bring a collections component to it. Like the fernery up at Ballarat, the brief was for fernery, and that can be a collection in its own right. But what we realised when we started looking at the planting design for inside the building was a lot of the plants were actually Australian. So we went, okay, let's do this entirely Australian natives, which is really interesting because they're not the Australian natives everyone thinks of. We've got lots of ferns, we've got ajugas, we've got violas in there, we've got the massive big elkhorn up on the wall, Platycerum bifurcatum. We've got aspleniums in there, we've got alocasias. They're not typical native plants. So I actually love that side of that collections development as well. But something like the Cloud Forest Garden, and I think it'd be interesting to ask Andrew, but the Arid Garden at Melbourne was the same for him, where you're presented with a group of plants to design to. It's really specific. And one of the lovely things that came out of that Congress in Singapore is I'm chatting to one of the landscape architects at Missouri Botanic Gardens in America, and we're just with another landscape architect in the US. We're just trying to have regular, few time a year catch ups just to chat about some of those complexities because it is very different to other landscape design work.
Yeah, well, I helped build the Indigenous garden at this year's garden show that Andrew has his own account listed design, and I was just blown away by the different range of plants that were all Indigenous as well. So not just
Yes.
native to Australia, but they were Indigenous to Victoria and within Melbourne. And the ferns was one of them that I was blown away by how they were all Indigenous.
Yeah.
It's fascinating.
It is fascinating. It really is. And the other thing that happens with something like the Cloud Forest Garden is usually what you're when you're working with those threatened plants, you are actually trying to modify the microclimate to match the plants. So on a normal design, we'll put in irrigation, but it's for establishment and to keep it looking good. We like to think that what we're designing would survive if the irrigation got turned off. We're really trying to not modify the microclimate to fit the plants. But when you're working with these threatened plants and these collection plants, you do need to. So you're putting a lot of thought into things like drainage and irrigation and aspect and all of that as well.
And I saw you had some big bluestone boulders there, like that would slice in half and then separated. That's a pretty cool design.
Thank you. So that actually came again from the stories of the collecting trips. So right at the start of the project, we had we always, for any project like that, we try and have a working group together where we actually have people with a whole lot of different perspectives involved in the project. So we had people from Parks Victoria and the site manager. We had people from the Rhododendron Society. We had one of the horticulturists up at Dandenong Ranges Botanic Gardens that had been on the collecting trip. And we had Warren Warboys, who was the legendary curator of horticulture at Cranbourne and was with Royal Botanic Gardens for 50 years or something like that. His plant knowledge is just phenomenal. But we asked them to tell us about those collecting trips, and they're telling us stories of the vegetation and what it was like climbing those mountains. And they had these photos of people walking up through these massive boulders that are, 8 meters high, massive. So it was the stories they told of what the vegetation was like up there and the photos we saw that actually inspired that design. And that's very much, I guess that's something I learnt from Andrew, but I try and carry through to our work, is that each project is individual and we try and sort of find something there we can work with.
Yeah. Yeah, I reckon it'd be a fascinating place to work, like all these different projects you work on. I imagine there's a lot of the documentation, which isn't as exciting, but yeah.
I love that.
Right.
That's because I did that for Andrew for 10 years.
Yeah.
I actually really like it when I do get to sit down and do some documentation.
Yeah. But yeah, it's so cool just seeing a different side of it.
Yeah.
So where do you see yourself being in 5 years' time? Like doing the same kind of stuff that you're doing at the moment?
I've never had long-term career plans.
Yep.
I'll often sort of think about, the next 12 months of the business and the sort of work we might want to take on. But I just sort of see what comes up. Sometimes I will sort of chase projects based on my staff's interest in the office too. I try and chat to them before taking on bigger projects. I'd like to continue to do more of the Botanic Gardens work, and I'd like the opportunity to work with some of the gardens outside Victoria. It's starting to happen a little bit, but I'd like it if there could be a bit more of that. It's probably more in that sort of strategic side of it, though, because it is hard to service a construction project if you have too much travel involved. It's not financially viable for the client and it's not practical for us. But to be able to do a bit more of that work would be lovely. Yeah.
And the last question for you, Andrea, is who do you think would be a good guest to have on the podcast?
I have been putting a lot of thought into this.
I think Chloe mentioned
Because,
5 people on her list. So
well, I'm going to keep mine a little bit shorter, but if I really let rip, you would have a list of 20 because I've had so many people I've been fortunate enough to work with, teach, etc. But I thought in order to narrow it down, I'll stick with Botanic Gardens because I don't think you've had a lot of people from that world. And I mean, the first one, I've got to say Andrew, but I know he's already on your list.
Yep.
But the other two, and even within the Botanic Gardens world, I've tried to choose two people that I think would be really interesting for those questions that you ask, because there's a lot of people that have just been in that world for their whole career. And the first suggestion I'm going to make is Claire Hart. Claire is currently acting executive director of Royal Botanic Gardens Melbourne, but I know Claire's got a really interesting career story, and she wasn't always in horticulture, and I think she would be really fascinating.
Yep.
The other one is someone who's right at the other end. So Amy Downey is only in her mid-20s, and she is an incredible horticulturist. She managed to get herself a scholarship to go to Singapore. She presented in Singapore. She's taught herself to abseil, to look after the escarpment plantings and go on plant collecting trips at Melbourne. I probably shouldn't say too much, but Amy's fantastic, and Costa was actually singing her praises on Instagram just recently about how much he loves chatting to her, and I think Amy would be incredible as well. And yeah, and she's come at, she's at the start of her career, but I think she would be a fantastic guest.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thank you so much for those recommendations, and thank you so much for coming on and sharing your story as well. I absolutely found it fascinating, and yeah, it's opened my eyes up to the different side of design as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me, Joel.